The chill of the solicitor's office seeped through Lady Eleanor Vance's thin wool pelisse, a cold that had little to do with the weak autumn sun outside. It was the chill of finality, of doors closing one by one until only this single, unadorned mahogany door remained. Across the polished expanse of the desk, Mr. Abernathy, the man whose face seemed composed entirely of weary lines and grey dust, cleared his throat for the third time. He was stalling, a small kindness in a world that had suddenly become devoid of them. Eleonora kept her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on a faint water stain on the ceiling. To look at the solicitor was to acknowledge the truth of her situation. To look out the window, at the bustling London street, was to be reminded of a world she was no longer truly a part of. The stain, at least, was a fixed point of imperfection in an otherwise ruthlessly ordered room. It was something she could understand. Her father's debts had been a quiet, creeping sickness in their lives for years. Lord Vance had been a man of easy smiles and weaker resolve, a gambler who always believed his luck was about to turn. It never had. His death 6 weeks prior had not brought relief, only the grim arrival of creditors, their ledgers filled with numbers that spoke of utter ruin. Their Mayfair home was sold, the furniture catalogued for auction, the staff dismissed with tearful apologies, and wages they could ill afford. All that remained was her father's title, a hollow echo, and her own reputation, which was now their only currency. "My lady," Mr. Abernathy began, his voice raspy, "as we have discussed, the situation is acute. However, an offer has been made, a most substantial offer." Eleonora finally lowered her gaze. "From the Duke of Blackwood," she stated. It was not a question. There had only been one name whispered in the hushed, pitying circles that still acknowledged her existence. Alastair Thorne, the Duke of Blackwood. A man spoken of in tones usually reserved for winter storms or ancient crypts. He was immensely wealthy, powerful, and reclusive to the point of myth. He had inherited the title a decade ago, under tragic circumstances that society still. She was a name, a title, a pretty, respectable figurehead to be purchased. Her poverty was her chief asset. A desperate woman would not come with inconvenient expectations of affection or companionship. "The terms are specific," Mr. Abernathy continued, avoiding her eyes. "His Grace's generosity is without question. All of your late father's debts will be settled in full. A handsome settlement will be placed in a trust for your own use. Your family's name will be restored. And in return?" Eleonora's voice was quiet, but it cut through the musty air of the office with perfect clarity. The solicitor took a deep breath. "You will become the Duchess of Blackwood. You will reside at the manor. You will oversee the staff and the running of the estate. You will, on the rare occasions required, act as his hostess. His Grace, he has made it clear that this is to be a marriage in name and title only. A contract." The unspoken words hung between them, heavier than any parchment. "He will not share your bed. He will not share your life. He will give you his name, his wealth, his protection, and in return he will demand nothing of your heart, because he has no intention of offering his own." It was a cage, a gilded, spacious, comfortable cage, but a cage nonetheless. She would be trading one form of ruin for another, a slow, emotional starvation in place of a swift, financial one. But what choice did she have? The alternative was the charity of distant relatives, a life as a paid companion, watching her name fade into obscurity and shame. "There is one other matter," Mr. Abernathy added, his gaze flicking towards the door. "His Grace's younger sister, Lady Clara, resides at the manor. She is of a delicate constitution. He requires the new Duchess to provide a calming, stable presence for her. A wardress for a sickly sister." The list of duties grew. each one colder and more impersonal than the last. Eleonora pictured a vast, silent house, a husband who was a stranger, and a fragile charge she did not know, a life of shadows. The door to the office opened without a baritone, devoid of inflection. It was the sound of iron striking stone. "I was just explaining them, Your Grace," Abernathy stammered, scrambling to his feet. "Then be brief." The Duke did not turn. "There is no need for embellishment. It is a simple transaction. Her name for my security. Is that understood, Lady Eleonora?" He finally turned, his grey eyes pinning her to the chair. Eleonora felt her breath catch. This was not merely a cold man. This was a man who had walled himself away behind layers of ice so thick she could not imagine what, if anything, lived beneath them. She had expected indifference, but this was something more profound, a complete and utter emotional void. Summoning every ounce of the Vance pride that was her only true inheritance, she rose slowly to her feet, her spine straight. She met his gaze without flinching. "I understand perfectly, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her soul. "You are purchasing a duchess. You wish to be assured of the quality of your acquisition." For the first time, a flicker of something disturbed the frozen surface of his eyes. Surprise? Annoyance? It was gone as quickly as it appeared. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. "Precisely," he said. "The contract stipulates that you will have your own wing of the house. Your duties will be confined to the household and to Lady Clara. You will want for nothing material. My life, my time, and my person, however, are not part of this arrangement. You will not seek me out. You will not make demands upon my affections. We will dine together when I am in residence. We will appear in public together when absolutely necessary. Otherwise, we will lead separate lives under the same roof. Is that agreeable?" Each word was a brick in the wall he was building between them, a wall he expected her to help construct. She thought of the shame, the destitution, the cold nights spent wondering where the next meal would come from. She thought of this man's wealth, the power of his name to erase all of that. And she thought of the price, her future, her hope for a life shared, for warmth, for love. She let out a slow, silent breath. The choice had already been made for her by her father's fecklessness and her own dwindling options. "The terms are agreeable, Your Grace," she said, the words tasting of ash. He gave another sharp nod, his gaze already moving past her, as if she had ceased to be of interest. "Abernathy will handle the documents. The wedding will be a private affair at the Blackwood Chapel in 1 week's time. Be ready." And with that, he turned and was gone, leaving behind a silence that was colder and heavier than before. The transaction was complete. Lady Eleonora Vance was sold, and the Duke of Blackwood had his Duchess. The journey to Blackwood Manor was made in a carriage upholstered in dark, funereal velvet, its springs so perfectly balanced that the ride was unnervingly smooth. It felt less like a journey and more like a slow, inexorable slide into another realm. The late autumn countryside unspooled outside the window, a tapestry of grey skies and skeletal trees, their bare branches clawing at the mist that clung to the hollows. The weather was a perfect mirror for the state of her heart, somber, still, and shrouded in uncertainty. Eleonora had not seen her husband since that chilling meeting in the solicitor's office. The wedding had been as he'd promised, a cold, brief ceremony in a dusty chapel, witnessed only by Mr. Abernathy and a severe-looking woman who was introduced as Mrs. Davies, the housekeeper of Blackwood Manor. Alistair had spoken his vows in that same flat, resonant voice, his grey eyes fixed on a point somewhere over her shoulder. His hand, when he'd placed the heavy gold band on her finger, had been cool and firm, the touch as impersonal as a physician's. There had been no celebration, no kind words. Afterwards, he had simply handed her into this carriage, instructed the driver, and walked away without a backward glance. He would follow in his own conveyance later. She was cargo to be delivered. As the hours passed, the landscape grew wilder, the hills rising into brooding moors, stained purple with heather. The air grew colder. Finally, the carriage turned off the main road, passing through a set of immense wrought-iron gates. The Blackwood crest, a stoic, unadorned raven, forged into their center. The drive snaked through a dense forest of ancient oaks and yews, their branches so thick they blotted out what little light remained of the afternoon. A perpetual twilight seemed to reign here, and then she saw it. Blackwood Manor did not rise from the landscape so much as it commanded it. A vast, Gothic edifice of dark grey stone that seemed to have absorbed the gloom of the surrounding woods. Its many windows were like vacant eyes, its turrets sharp and accusatory against the bruised sky. A sense of profound, oppressive silence emanated from it, a silence that spoke of long-held grief and secrets locked away. It was less a home and more a mausoleum. The carriage crunched to a halt on a gravel drive before a set of mass spectres. The air smelled of beeswax, old stone, and something else, something like dust and disuse, the scent of a place where life was lived in only a few select corners, leaving the rest to time and memory. A line of servants stood at attention, their faces impassive, their eyes downcast. Mrs. Davis introduced them in a low monotone, the butler, the head footman, the cook, and each offered a bow or a curtsy as sterile as the last. They were components of a well-oiled machine, nothing more. "Your rooms are in the east wing, Your Grace," the housekeeper said, her tone suggesting this was a point of particular importance. "As per the Duke's instructions, I will show you the way. The east wing. You will have your own wing of the house." The first brick in the wall he had promised. She followed the housekeeper up a grand, sweeping staircase, her footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. They passed portraits of Alistair's ancestors, their stern, painted eyes following her progress with silent judgment. They walked down a long gallery, dust motes dancing in the thin shafts of light from the tall, narrow windows. The air grew colder here, the scent of disuse more pronounced. Finally, Mrs. Davis stopped before a pair of polished oak doors. "This is the Duchess's suite. Your maid, Agnes, is waiting within. Your trunks have been unpacked. If you require anything, you may pull the bell rope." The dismissal was clear. This was her territory. The rest of the house was not. Inside, the rooms were magnificent. A sitting room, furnished in shades of deep blue and cream. A spacious bedchamber, with a large four-poster bed draped in velvet, and a connecting dressing room. A fire had been lit here as well, and it lent a small measure of cheer to the space. A young woman with a kind, anxious face stood by the hearth, bobbing a quick curtsy. This was Agnes, her new maid. "Welcome to Blackwood, Your Grace," Agnes murmured, her voice soft. Eleonora managed a small smile. "Thank you, Agnes." She moved to the window and looked out. Her rooms overlooked a vast, sprawling garden, or what had once been a garden. Now it was a tangled mass of overgrown rose bushes, choked flower beds, and crumbling stone paths. It was a place of profound neglect, beautiful in its decay, but overwhelmingly sad. At the far end, half hidden by a curtain of ivy, stood a large glass structure, its panes clouded with grime, an orangery, perhaps. Like the house, the garden seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for a life that had long since departed. In the days that followed, Eleonora learned the rhythms of her new prison. She woke in her silent rooms, was attended by the quiet and efficient Agnes, and took her meals alone in a small, private dining room adjoining her suite. She explored her designated wing, discovering a small library filled with poetry and botany texts, and a music room with a dusty, out-of-tune pianoforte. She was a ghost in a house of ghosts. Of the Duke she saw almost nothing. She heard the distant sound of his horse's hooves on the gravel some evenings, a sign of his return from wherever he went. They dined together precisely twice in the first week. The meals were agonizingly formal affairs in the cavernous main dining hall, the long table a polished wasteland between them. He would inquire formally after her comfort. She would reply formally that she was well, and then silence would descend again, broken only by the clink of silver on porcelain. He never truly looked at her, His gaze was always distant, his thoughts clearly 1,000 miles away, locked in some private, desolate landscape of his own. Her inquiries about Lady Clara were met with polite but firm deflections from Mrs. Davis. Lady Clara is resting. She does not receive visitors. It was during her second week that she finally encountered the other power in the house. She had ventured down to the main library, a magnificent two-story room paneled in dark wood, searching for a book on local flora. A woman was standing by the fire, one slender hand resting on the marble mantelpiece. She was beautiful, with hair the color of spun gold and eyes the blue of a summer sky. But there was a hardness to her mouth that belied the softness of her features. The woman turned as Eleonora entered, her blue eyes sweeping over her in a cool, appraising glance. "So, you are the new Duchess," she said, her voice smooth as cream, but with an edge of something sharp beneath it. "I am Lady Beatrice Thorne, Alistair's cousin." Eleonora inclined her head. "A pleasure to meet you, Lady Beatrice." "Is it?" Beatrice smiled, a slow, deliberate curving of her lips that did not reach her eyes. "I have been managing Blackwood for Alistair for years. I must confess, we were all quite surprised when he announced his intention to marry. He is not a man given to impulse." The implication was clear. Eleonora was an impulse, a foolish acquisition. "The circumstances were compelling," Eleonora replied, keeping her tone even. "Ah, yes, the Vance debts," Beatrice said, with a little sigh of feigned sympathy. "Tragic. Still, you have landed on your feet, haven't you? A duchess. It is quite the title, even if the duties are limited." Her eyes held a challenging glint. She was the mistress of this house in all but name, and she was making it clear that Eleonora's title meant little to her. She was a rival, another lock on a house already full of them. "I had hoped to meet Lady Clara," Eleonora said, changing the subject. "Mrs. Davis tells me she is unwell." Beatrice's expression tightened. "Clara is very delicate. Her nerves are not strong. She requires absolute quiet. I see to her needs myself. It is best if she is not disturbed by new faces." She was being warned off. Clara, like the Duke himself, was off limits. Eleonora was to remain in her wing, a duchess in name only, a decorative object with no real function or place. The cold truce of her arrangement was being enforced not just by the Duke's absence, but by his cousin's active hostility. Later that day, driven by a desperate need for air and space, Eleonora bundled herself in a heavy cloak and walked out into the neglected gardens. The air was damp and smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves. She followed a barely visible path, her boots sinking into the soft ground, until she found herself standing before the glass house she had seen from her window. It was an orangery, a magnificent one, though it was now in a state of heartbreaking disrepair. Several panes of glass were cracked, and one entire panel was missing, allowing the wind to whistle through. Ivy had forced its way through the foundations. She peered through a grimy pane of glass. Inside, she could just make out the shapes of withered, skeletal trees in large terracotta pots, their dead leaves carpeting the stone floor. It was a tomb for things that had once been beautiful and alive. As she stood there, a young footman carrying a basket of logs passed by on a distant path. He saw her, and his eyes widened in something that looked like fear. He quickly averted his gaze, hastening his step as if he had seen a ghost. His reaction was strange. It was more than just surprise at seeing the new Duchess in this forgotten corner of the estate. It was alarm. Later, she asked Agnes about it, her tone deliberately casual. "I discovered the most beautiful old orangery in the gardens today. It seems a shame it has fallen into such disrepair." Agnes, who was turning down the bed, froze for a second, her hands stilling on the counterpane. "The orangery, Your Grace," she said, her voice hushed. "No one goes there." Why not? The maid's gaze darted towards the door, as if afraid of being overheard. It was her Grace's place, the Duke's mother. She loved it more than anything, filled it with exotic flowers and orange trees. After she passed, the Duke had it locked. The key was put away. He said no one was ever to enter it again. He said he wanted it left just as she left it, to be left to die. That is what he had meant. He had not preserved a memory, he had entombed it. The coldness of the man, the sheer depth of his grief or his anger, was staggering. He had locked away a piece of his own home, his own past, and commanded it to wither and decay. This was the first true crack Eleanora had seen in his impenetrable facade. It was not just coldness that defined him. It was a wound, a deep and festering wound, so profound that he had quarantined a part of his own world to keep from touching it. The neglected garden, the locked orangery, the silent house, they were all extensions of the man himself. And as she stood at her window that night, looking out at the dark, skeletal shape of the glass house under a sliver of moon, Eleanora felt the first stirrings of something other than fear or resignation. It was a sliver of purpose. She did not know how or why, but she knew she could not simply live in this house of decay. She had to try to bring something back to life. Eleanora's days settled into a quiet, watchful rhythm. She was an observer, a student of the silences that permeated Blackwood Manor. She learned the specific cadence of the Duke's solitary footsteps in the hall late at night, the way the wind moaned through the ill-fitting casement window in the east gallery, the precise moment in the afternoon when the sun, on the rare days it appeared, would strike the tarnished silver on the sideboard and cast a fleeting, lonely gleam. Her existence was one of polite, enforced isolation. Lady Beatrice remained a constant, subtle adversary. She would appear at luncheon, which Eleanora was now expected to attend in the main dining room, and deliver meticulously crafted, back-handed compliments. "That is a lovely gown, Your Grace. It is remarkable what the city modistes can do with such simple fabrics." Or she would inquire after Eleanora's activities with a cloying sweetness that was more insulting than open hostility. "I do hope you are not finding the days too empty. It must be a significant change from the bustle of London society." Eleanora met these small aggressions with a placid dignity that she knew infuriated Beatrice more than any retort would. She answered politely, her voice calm, revealing nothing of the frustration that simmered beneath the surface. She was playing a long, quiet game, and she would not allow Beatrice to dictate the terms of her surrender. Her primary focus, the one thing that gave her a sense of purpose beyond simply enduring, became twofold: Lady Clara and the orangery. They were the two locked rooms of Blackwood, one metaphorical, one literal, and she was determined to find a key to both. Clara remained an enigma, a whisper behind a closed door. Beatrice's control over her was absolute. Any attempt by Eleanora to see her was met with the same unyielding excuse: "Her nerves are too fragile today." Eleanora began to suspect that Clara's isolation served Beatrice's interests more than it served Clara's health. A dependent, isolated charge was a source of power, a way for Beatrice to make herself indispensable to the Duke. So Eleanora changed her tactics. She began to leave small, anonymous gifts outside Clara's door. A single, perfect, late-blooming rose she found clinging to life in the ravaged garden. A small book of pressed flowers she made from specimens gathered on her walks. A pretty ribbon she had Agnes purchase from the village. She never left a note, never announced the gesture. They were silent offerings, small messages of care sent into the void, hoping for a response. For weeks there was nothing. The items would simply be gone the next morning, presumably removed by a maid or Beatrice herself. Her other project was the orangery. The footman's fearful reaction had confirmed it was forbidden territory. To challenge the Duke's explicit command was a risk, but it was a risk she felt compelled to take. The decaying glass house called to her, a symbol of all the suffocated life in the manor. She began by searching for the key. She looked in every drawer of the dusty desks in the East Wing library, in every forgotten cabinet. It was Agnes who finally, inadvertently, gave her a clue. While helping Eleonora organize some books, the maid mentioned that the old head groundskeeper, a man named Fletcher, who had served the family for 50 years before retiring to a cottage on the edge of the estate, had been the one to lock the orangery on the Duke's orders. The next afternoon, under the guise of a walk, Eleonora made her way to the groundskeeper's cottage. It was a small, neat stone building, with a plume of smoke rising from its chimney. An old man with a face as weathered as a tree root was chopping wood in the yard. He looked up, his faded blue eyes widening in surprise as she approached. "Mr. Fletcher?" "Your Grace," he said, leaning his axe against the chopping block and wiping his hands on his trousers. He gave a stiff, rheumatic bow. "Forgive me for disturbing you. I am the Duchess of Blackwood." "I know who you are, Your Grace," he said, his voice a low burr. "News travels, even out here." "I had a question, if you don't mind," she began, choosing her words carefully. "I was admiring the gardens, and the old orangery. It is such a magnificent structure. I was told you were the one who cared for it." A shadow passed over the old man's face. "Aye, in the old Duchess's time, it was her pride and joy. Warm as a summer's day in there, even in the dead of winter, full of life." "It's a shame to see it now," Eleonora said softly. "The Duke had it locked, I understand." Fletcher nodded, his gaze distant. "He did. After the tragedy. He was not himself. He said he wanted nothing touched, just left." The old man sighed, a sound of deep, weary sorrow. "It weren't right. Things need tending. Left alone, they die. People too, I reckon." There was a moment of silence between them, a shared understanding of the truth in his words. "He ordered the key put away," Eleonora prompted gently. Fletcher looked at her, his eyes sharp and assessing. He saw something in her face, her quiet determination, perhaps her genuine sadness for the neglected space, and made a decision. "He told me to give the key to the housekeeper, to be locked in his father's desk in the main study. But I knew the lock. I knew the old Duchess kept a spare, hidden, in case she ever misplaced her own." He shuffled over to a loose stone in the cottage wall, prying it out with his thick fingers. From the cavity behind it he withdrew a small, rust-pitted iron key. "She kept it here," he said, holding it out to Eleonora, "under the stone by the jasmine trellis. I moved it here after. Figured it was safer. A place like that. It ought to have a chance. It ought to have someone who remembers what it was." Eleonora's fingers closed around the cold metal. It felt heavy, significant, a tangible piece of the house's secret history. "Thank you, Mr. Fletcher," she whispered. "Be careful, Your Grace," he warned. "The Duke's grief is a hard, sharp thing. You'd do well not to get in its way." That evening, as dusk settled, Eleonora slipped out of the house, the key clutched in her hand. The air was cold and damp. She made her way to the orangery, her heart beating a nervous rhythm against her ribs. The lock was stiff and rusted, but after a moment of struggle, it turned with a loud, grating groan. The door swung inward on protesting hinges, releasing a gust of stale, cloying air, thick with the scent of dust and decay. She stepped inside, pulling the door closed behind her. It was even sadder within than she had imagined. The skeletons of orange and lemon trees stood in their massive pots, their branches brittle and bare. The shriveled remains of exotic flowers crumbled to dust on the dry soil of the planting beds. The air was still and dead, but the structure itself was sound, its elegant iron framework still strong, its glass panels, though grimy, mostly intact. The potential for beauty was still there, buried under layers of neglect. She had found her sanctuary, her secret project. Over the next weeks, this became her ritual. Every day, For an hour or two, she would slip away to the orangery. She started by simply cleaning. With a bucket and rags, smuggled from a forgotten supply closet, she began the painstaking process of washing the grime from the glass panes. As she worked, letting in the pale autumn light, it felt as if she were letting a little light into her own life as well. She found old tools in a rusted cabinet, trowels, shears, a watering can. She began the heartbreaking work of clearing the dead plants, whispering a small apology to the memory of the woman who had loved them. Script: Eleonora Thorne, her garden book, the same name as hers. It was the journal of the Duke's mother. She sat down on an overturned pot, the journal in her hands, and began to read. It was not a diary of emotions, but a gardener's log. Entries detailed the planting of a new orchid from the Orient, a battle with aphids on the rose bushes, the joy of the first lemon blossom of spring. But woven between the practical notes was a profound sense of peace and love for this place. "The world outside can be loud and demanding," one entry read, "but in here there is only growth, only patience. Alastair brought me a ladybug on a leaf today. He has his father's serious eyes, but my love for the quiet, growing things, I pray he never loses that." Tears pricked Eleonora's eyes. She was not just restoring a building, she was communing with a spirit. The spirit of a woman who had found solace in this very spot. A woman who had loved the quiet, serious boy, who had grown into the cold, broken man who was now her husband. A few days later, the first sign of a thaw came from the other locked room. As Eleonora passed Lady Clara's suite, she noticed the door was slightly ajar. Peeking through the crack, she saw a maidservant collecting a luncheon tray, and on the tray, next to the untouched plate of food, was the small book of pressed flowers she had left days before. It was open. Someone had been looking at it. It was the smallest of victories, but it felt monumental. A connection had been made, a silent message received. Hope, as fragile as a winter seedling, began to push its way through the frozen ground of her heart. She was no longer just an observer, an outsider. She was taking initiative. She was, in her own quiet way, beginning to tend the neglected gardens of Blackwood, both outside her window and within its walls. The first frost of winter silvered the overgrown lawns of Blackwood, and still, Eleonora's life continued in its circumscribed pattern. The cold civility of the house, the secret, life-giving labor in the orangery, and the silent overtures to the invisible Lady Clara. The journal of the first Duchess had become her guide, a treasured companion in her solitude. In its pages, she discovered not only the layout of the original gardens, but also the spirit of the woman who had planted them, a spirit of gentle perseverance that Eleonora sought to emulate. Following the old Duchess's notes, she began to take cuttings from the hardiest of the surviving rose bushes in the outer garden, potting them in fresh soil she'd had Agnes procure for her from the village, under the guise of needing it for some indoor ferns. She found a packet of forgotten seeds, winter-blooming jasmine, in the rotted box with the journal, and planted them in a pot, placing it in the sunniest spot in the orangery. Tending these small pockets of life was an act of faith against the oppressive gloom of the estate. One blustery afternoon, as she was carefully pruning a dead branch from a skeletal lemon tree, she heard the orangery door creak open. Her heart leaped into her throat. She froze, shears in hand, hidden behind the bulk of a large terracotta pot. She had grown careless, so absorbed in her work that she had not been listening for footsteps. It had to be Mrs. Davies, or worse, Beatrice, come to discover her transgression. But the footsteps that echoed on the stone floor were heavier, their tread measured and firm. They were masculine. It was the Duke. Eleonora's blood ran cold. She remained utterly still, hardly daring to breathe. This was it. He would be furious. He would see her actions as a violation, a desecration of his mother's memory, and a direct defiance of his command. The wall between them, already so high, would become insurmountable. He walked slowly into the center of the room, his tall frame a dark silhouette against the newly cleaned glass. He stopped, his head turning as he took in the scene. He saw the swept floors, the neatly stacked piles of dead foliage, the clean panes of glass letting in the weak afternoon light. He saw the small pots with their new rose cuttings, and the carefully turned soil in one of the large planting beds. He saw the evidence of weeks of secret, patient labor. His back was to her, so she could not see his expression. But the rigid set of his shoulders spoke of a deep, coiling tension. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Eleonora's knuckles were white where she gripped the shears. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and laced with a chillingly familiar coldness. "What is the meaning of this?" There was no point in hiding. Taking a steadying breath, she stepped out from behind the planter. "Your Grace." He turned slowly. His face was a mask of granite, but his pale grey eyes burned with an intensity she had never seen before. It was not the empty void she was used to. It was a fire, a dangerous, glacial fire of pure, undiluted fury. "I gave an order," he said, each word a chip of ice. "This place was to be left untouched." "I know," she said, her own voice surprisingly steady. She would not be cowed. She had Fletcher's words in her mind. Things need tending. Left alone, they die. To leave it untouched was to allow it to die completely. "I did not believe that was what you truly wanted." "You presume to know what I want," he shot back, taking a step toward her. The air crackled with his anger. "You know nothing. This was my mother's. It was to remain as she left it." "She left it full of life," Eleonora countered, finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. She held up the small journal she had tucked into her apron pocket. "I found her gardening book. I have been reading it. This place was her sanctuary, a place of growth and peace. To let it crumble into dust and decay, that is not a tribute, Your Grace. It is an insult to her memory. It is a monument to grief, not to her life." He stopped, his eyes falling on the journal in her hand. His expression faltered for a fraction of a second, the anger momentarily eclipsed by a flash of raw, unguarded pain. It was so swift she might have imagined it, but it was there. He had loved his mother. The depth of that love was etched into the violence of his grief. "I wanted to bring it back," she continued softly, her courage building as his anger seemed to momentarily recede. "Not to erase her, but to honor her, to make it a place she would recognize, a place of life." She gestured to the small pot of jasmine seedlings, where the first 2 tiny green leaves were just beginning to unfurl. "She wrote of this jasmine. I found the seeds. I thought she would have wanted them to grow." Alistair stood frozen, his gaze fixed on that tiny speck of green. He looked from the seedlings to the journal. Then finally, his eyes lifted to meet hers. The inferno of his anger was gone. In its place was something she could not name, a profound weariness, a confusion, a flicker of something so foreign to his features she could hardly identify it. It was as if she had spoken a language he had long forgotten, but still, on some deep, instinctual level, understood. He said nothing. The silence returned, but its quality had changed. It was no longer the aggressive, angry silence of before, but a heavy, thoughtful one. He looked around the orangery again, his eyes lingering on the small signs of her care. He saw not defiance, but devotion. He saw not a transgression, but a restoration. Without another word, he turned on his heel and walked out, his footsteps echoing until they faded into nothing. He did not say she could continue. He did not say she must stop. He simply left. But the next day, the great oak door to the orangery, which she had always carefully locked behind her, was left slightly ajar. And the day after that, a stack of new, empty terracotta pots appeared just inside the entrance, with no explanation of how they had gotten there. It was a concession, a silent, grudging permission, a glimmer of something. Not warmth, not yet, but a crack in the ice. He had seen what she was. Jet black hair as her brother, though hers was lank and uncared for. This was Clara. She looked up as Eleonora entered, her eyes, the same pale grey as the Duke's, wide with a terrified, deer-like alarm. "I'm sorry to intrude," Eleonora said softly, keeping her distance so as not to frighten the girl further. "I heard you crying. I was worried." "You should not be in here," Clara whispered, her voice thin and reedy. "Beatrice said—" "Beatrice is not here now," Eleonora said gently. "What is wrong? Can I help?" Clara shook her head, clutching a small embroidered handkerchief in her fist. It's just the nightmares. They are bad today. I'm so sorry, Eleonora said, her heart going out to the fragile girl. She took a tentative step closer. Sometimes when I am sad, I find that a little warmth helps. She moved to the fireplace and, finding it already laid with wood and kindling, used the nearby matches to light a fire. A small flame flickered to life, pushing back the gloom. She then went to the windows and pulled back the heavy velvet curtains, letting the pale afternoon light flood the room. Clara flinched, but then her eyes fell upon the world outside, the gardens, the distant moors, the vast sky. It was as if she hadn't truly seen it in years. Eleonora did not press her to talk. She simply pulled up a small stool and sat near the now crackling fire, taking out a small piece of mending from her pocket. She worked in companionable silence, her quiet, calm presence a stark contrast to the nervous energy that seemed to radiate from Clara. After a long while, Clara spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "You are the one who leaves the flowers." Eleonora looked up and smiled. "I am. They are pretty," Clara said, a faint hint of color rising in her pale cheeks. "Thank you." It was a beginning, a fragile, tentative connection forged in a dim, lonely room. When Eleonora left an hour later, Clara was no longer huddled in her chair, but was sitting by the window, watching the last of the light fade from the sky. The wall around Clara was not as high or as thick as her brother's. It was built of fear, not of anger. And Eleonora knew, with a certainty that warmed her to her soul, burgeoning life in the frozen world. The winter-blooming jasmine she had planted was thriving, its delicate vines beginning to climb a small trellis she had repaired. The scent of damp earth and green growing things was a balm to her spirit. Her friendship with Clara deepened with each passing day. She now spent an hour with her every afternoon, a ritual that Beatrice observed with a look of thunderous disapproval, but, surprisingly, did not forbid. Perhaps she had complained to the Duke and been rebuffed, or perhaps she felt confident that Eleonora's influence was a fleeting novelty. Whatever the reason, she left them alone. Eleonora would read aloud to Clara, poetry, novels, travelogues from the Duke's vast library. She discovered Clara had a keen, intelligent mind that had been starved of stimulation, and a shy, gentle wit that began to emerge from behind the walls of her fear. They would talk quietly by the fire, Eleonora speaking of her life in London, of plays and art galleries, and Clara, in turn, would share small, hesitant memories of her childhood, of riding a pony in the summer meadows, of her mother teaching her needlepoint. She never spoke of the tragedy, and Eleonora never asked. The past was a sleeping dragon they both instinctively knew not to wake. The small, cumulative changes in the house were beginning to be felt. The door to Clara's room was now often open. The scent of lemon polish and fresh flowers, small bouquets Eleonora arranged from the few hardy blooms she could find, began to replace the stale, dusty air in the east wing. They were minor shifts, but in a house so steeped in stagnant ritual, they felt seismic. Alistair remained a distant, brooding presence, but something had irrevocably shifted between them since the confrontation in the orangery. The dinners were still quiet, but the silence was no longer entirely empty. She would occasionally catch him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, his expression unreadable, his grey eyes holding a question he never asked. He started asking about Clara, his inquiries brief and formal, but they were inquiries nonetheless. "Lady Clara seems improved," he commented one evening, staring into his wineglass. "She is finding her strength," Eleonora replied. "She has a quick mind. I have been reading to her from your collection of Italian poets." He looked up at that, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "She enjoys poetry?" "Very much. She has a fine ear for it." He said nothing more, but the next day, a slim, leather-bound volume of Petrarch's sonnets was left on the hall table outside Clara's rooms. There was no note. None was needed. The shared challenge that would irrevocably alter their fragile truce arrived with the new year, carried on the back of a vicious, biting wind that screamed down from the moors. It began as a cough, a small, dry rattle in Clara's chest. Within 2 days, it had deepened into a severe, racking sickness that left her weak and feverish. The local physician, a portly, well-meaning man named Dr. Harris, was summoned. He fussed and fretted, listened to Clara's chest with a grim expression, and prescribed bed rest, mustard plasters, and beef tea. "It is an inflammation of the lungs," he declared gravely. "Her constitution is weak. We must be vigilant." Beatrice immediately seized control, swooping into the sick room with an air of grim authority. She dismissed Eleonora with a curt, "I will handle this. I am accustomed to Clara's ailments." She insisted on keeping the room dark and airless, believing night air to be poisonous, and plied Clara with foul-smelling herbal remedies that only seemed to make her weaker. Eleonora watched with a growing sense of dread. Clara was not improving. She was getting worse. Her fever climbed, her breathing grew shallow and labored, and she slipped into a state of restless delirium. Eleonora, relegated to the hallway outside the sick room, felt a desperate sense of helplessness. She retreated to the main library, her mind racing. She could not stand by and do nothing. She began to search through the medical texts on the shelves. Books her father, a man of fleeting but diverse intellectual interests, had taught her to respect. She found a newer volume, published only a few years prior by a physician at the University of Edinburgh. It spoke of lung fever, and it advocated for methods that were the direct opposite of what Beatrice was doing. It called for cool, fresh air to ease the lungs, for steam inhalations to loosen the chest, for gentle, persistent hydration instead of heavy broths. Armed with this knowledge, she sought out the Duke. She found him in his study, a room she had never before entered. It was a starkly masculine space, dominated by a massive desk and shelves filled with books on agriculture, law, and engineering. He was standing by the window, staring out at the snow-swept landscape, a glass of brandy untouched in his hand. "Your Grace," she said from the doorway. He turned, his face etched with worry. The iron control he usually maintained was fractured, revealing the anxious brother beneath. "What is it?" "It is about Clara," she said, stepping into the room. "I am worried." Dr. Harris is torn. To trust Eleonora was to defy Beatrice, who had been his confidant and manager for years. It was to question the established order of his own house. "Alistair, you cannot be entertaining this foolishness." Beatrice's sharp voice cut through the room. She stood in the doorway, her face a mask of outrage. "This woman knows nothing of medicine. Clara is my family. I will not have her subjected to some new-fangled, dangerous experiment based on a book." The confrontation hung in the air, thick and volatile. Alistair looked from his cousin's furious face to Eleonora's calm, determined one. He saw the logic in Eleonora's words, the desperation in her eyes, and he saw the fear and pride warring in Beatrice's. "She is my wife, Beatrice," Alistair said, his voice dangerously quiet, "and she is the Duchess of this house." It was the first time he had ever defended her, ever acknowledged her position with any real weight. "We will try her methods," Beatrice gasped, her face pale with fury and disbelief. "You would trust her over me?" "I will trust what is best for my sister," he said, his tone final. He turned to Eleonora. "What do you need?" It was the beginning of a long, desperate night. Working together, they became an unlikely, efficient team. Alistair, his face grim and set, personally opened the heavy sash windows, letting the clean, cold winter air circulate through the room. Eleonora directed the servants to keep a kettle boiling constantly on the fire, creating a humidifying steam. She sat by Clara's bedside, patiently spooning sips of cool water and weak, sweetened tea between her parched lips, and wiped her brow with cloths soaked in lavender water. Alistair stood by the fireplace, a silent, anxious sentinel. He watched Eleonora, his expression a mixture of awe and apprehension. He saw her competence, her gentleness, the quiet authority with which she commanded the worried maids. She was not the ornamental duchess he had purchased. She was a woman of substance, of strength, of profound compassion. Sometime after midnight, in the depths of her fever, Clara began to murmur, her head thrashing on the pillows. Her words were slurred, indistinct, but one name emerged with horrifying clarity. Rowan. No, don't let him. Rowan. Alistair froze, as if struck by lightning. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a stark, greyish white. The glass he was holding slipped from his fingers and shattered on the stone hearth, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He stared at his sister, his eyes wide, with a look of pure, unadulterated agony. It was the look of a man seeing a ghost. At that moment, Beatrice, who had been hovering resentfully in the hallway, swept back into the room. She had heard the name. Her eyes, sharp and venomous, darted to Alistair's horrified face. "She still has nightmares of him," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with a strange, triumphant malice. "Even after all these years. Some things, you see, can never be fixed." Eleonora looked from Clara's fevered face to Alistair's mask of torment, to Beatrice's cruel, knowing smile. A chill that had nothing to do with the winter air snaked down her spine. Who was Rowan? And what terrible power did his name hold to shatter the iron control of the Duke of Blackwood, and bring such a look of dark satisfaction to his cousin's face? The sleeping dragon had stirred. A piece of the house's buried history had just been unearthed, and it was something dark and violent and very, very raw. The crisis passed as the winter dawn broke, painting the snow-covered landscape in pale shades of rose and grey. Clara's fever finally broke. Her breathing eased, the shallow, ragged gasps deepening into the slow, steady rhythm of natural sleep. The air in the room, cool and fresh, felt clean, as if the sickness itself had been washed away. Eleonora, exhausted but relieved, sat by the bedside, her hand resting gently on Clara's. Dr. Harris arrived mid-morning, his expression one of astonishment as he examined his patient. He mumbled about the resilience of youth and the mysterious ways of Providence, unable to admit that the very methods he would have condemned had likely saved the girl's life. Alistair had not left the room all night. He had remained by the fire, a silent, brooding statue carved from shadow and worry. Now, in the light of day, he looked utterly spent. The mask of ducal indifference was gone, stripped away by the long hours of fear, leaving behind the raw, vulnerable face of a man who had been pushed to the edge of his endurance. The name his sister had uttered had plunged him into a dark, interior place where Eleonora could not follow. Beatrice, her authority usurped and her methods proven wrong, had retreated, her simmering resentment a palpable force in the hallway. She had lost this battle, and her defeat had curdled into a quiet, dangerous poison. Late that afternoon, Clara woke. Her eyes were clear, the fever gone. She saw Eleonora by her side and managed a weak but genuine smile. Then her gaze shifted, finding her brother standing by the window. "Alistair," she whispered. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, his relief so profound it was painful to witness. He sat on the edge of her bed and took her other hand, his touch surprisingly gentle. "I am here, Clara. You are safe." "Thank you," she murmured, her gaze moving between her brother and Eleonora. "Both of you." It was a moment of pure, unadulterated connection, a small circle of warmth in the cold, vast house. Eleonora felt a lump form in her throat. She quietly excused herself, leaving the brother and sister to their reunion. She sought refuge in the one place that felt like her own, the orangery. The air inside was warm and humid, a stark contrast to the frozen world outside. The scent of damp earth was a comfort. She sank onto a wooden bench, the exhaustion of the last 48 hours washing over her in a great wave. She had done it. She had defied Beatrice, earned the Duke's trust, and helped save Clara. She had carved out a real place for herself in this house, a place built not on a title, but on action and compassion. The door opened behind her. It was Alistair. He walked toward her, his footsteps slow on the stone flags. The anger he had shown in this room weeks ago was gone. In its place was a heavy, somber stillness. He stopped before her, but he did not speak. He simply looked around at the signs of her patient labor. The climbing jasmine, the healthy rose cuttings, the clean glass that let the winter sun stream in, turning the space into a jewel box of light. "Xiao, she would have liked what you have done here," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. Eleonora looked up at him. The walls were down. The grief he had kept locked away for a decade was visible in the depths of his grey eyes. "Tell me about her, Alistair," she said softly, using his given name for the first time. He took a deep, shuddering breath, as if the request itself caused him physical pain. He began to pace, his movements tight and agitated. "My mother, Eleonora, she was like this place, full of light and warmth. She made everything grow, but she was fragile, more fragile than any of us knew." He stopped pacing and stared out at the snow. "My father was a good man, a stern man, a traditionalist. He loved her, but he did not always understand her need for life, for vibrancy. He saw his duty as protecting her, which to him meant sheltering her. He did not see he was caging her." The story came out of him in broken pieces, a confession torn from a place of deep, unhealed trauma. His mother, lonely and stifled, had fallen under the spell of another man, a charismatic neighbor, a poet named Rowan. He was charming, passionate, and utterly without scruple. He had preyed on her vulnerability. "It was an affair," Alistair said, the words tasting like poison, a sordid, secret thing that filled the house with whispers and lies. "I was a boy, 16, never got up." Eleonora gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. It wasn't an illness. It was a death caused by violence. Rowan fled into the night. The official story was that my father had slipped and fallen. An accident. It was easier that way. It buried the scandal. But we knew. My mother, Clara, and I. We knew the truth. He paused, his breathing ragged. Clara was only 6. She had crept out of her room, drawn by the noise. She saw it. She saw our father fall. She saw Rowan standing over him. The shock. It broke something inside her. It is the source of her fragility, her nightmares. She has never truly recovered. And his mother? Eleonora barely dared to ask. "The guilt consumed her," Alistair said, his voice hollow. "She blamed herself entirely. The light in her went out for good. She retreated from the world, from us. She would spend her days in here, in this orangery. But she no longer tended the plants. She just sat, staring, wasting away. 6 months later, she was gone. The doctors called it consumption, but it was grief, a broken heart. She simply willed herself to die. The full, horrifying scope of the tragedy settled over Eleonora. A father killed, a mother dead from guilt, a sister traumatized into permanent fragility, and a boy left to become the master of a house of ghosts, his heart frozen by a horror no child should ever witness. His coldness, his distance, his iron control. It was all a defense mechanism. He had seen the destructive power of passion, of emotion, and he had vowed to banish it from his life, to encase his heart in ice, so it could never be broken again. "And Rowan?" she whispered. A truly dangerous look entered Alistair's eyes, a flash of the ruthless aristocrat beneath the grieving man. His family was persuaded it would be best for him to travel abroad, indefinitely. His finances were arranged. He was never seen in this country again. My father's honor was protected. The scandal was contained. But the poison remained. He finally turned to face her, his eyes filled with a decade of unshed tears. "That is why I made the terms of our marriage so cold. I cannot allow that kind of emotion into my life. I will not. It destroys everything it touches. I needed a Duchess who would be a partner in duty, not in feeling. I needed to keep my world safe, contained. Before Eleonora could respond, the orangery door opened again. Beatrice stood there, her face a pale, tight mask of fury. She had clearly been listening. "He has told you, then," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "His sad, sordid little story. But did he tell you my part in it?" Alistair stared at her. "Beatrice, what are you talking about?" A twisted, ugly smile touched her lips. "I was always there, Alistair, always picking up the pieces. But you never saw me. It was always her, your perfect, fragile mother. And then, when you inherited, I thought, finally, but you just closed yourself away. So I waited." She took a step into the room, her eyes burning with a feverish intensity. "Did you ever wonder how Rowan grew so bold? How he knew when your father would be away? I helped him. I encouraged him. I passed messages. I wanted the affair to be discovered. I thought the scandal would disgrace her, that your father would cast her out, and then you would finally turn to me." The confession was monstrous, a snake uncoiling in their midst. She had not just witnessed the tragedy, she had actively cultivated it for her own selfish ends. "I loved you," she spat at Alistair, her voice cracking. "And you married this impoverished stranger. You let her into my house. You let her take my place." Alistair looked at his cousin as if seeing her for the first time. The woman who had been his confidant, his pillar of support, was a manipulative creature who had nurtured the very thing that had destroyed his family. The betrayal was absolute, a final, devastating blow. "Get out," he said, his voice barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. "Alistair, get out of my house. Now." Beatrice stared at him for a long moment, her face crumbling as she realized she had lost everything. Then, with a choked sob, she turned and fled. The silence she left behind was profound. The full, ugly truth of Blackwood Manor lay exposed in the warm, sunlit air of the orangery. Alistair stood as if turned to stone, shattered by the dual revelations of his past and Beatrice's treachery. Eleonora rose from the bench and went to him. She did not know what to say. Words were inadequate for a wound this deep, so she said nothing. She simply stood before him, her presence a quiet statement of solidarity, of understanding. She reached out and gently, tentatively, placed her hand on his arm. It was the first time she had ever touched him with deliberate tenderness. At her touch, something within him finally broke. A tremor ran through his powerful frame. The iron control he had maintained for a decade shattered into a million pieces. A low, ragged sound tore from his throat, the sound of a pain so immense it had been held in silence for a lifetime. He did not weep, but his whole body shook with the force of his repressed grief. He swayed, and instinctively, Eleonora stepped closer, her arms going around him to steady him. He was rigid at first, unused to comfort, to contact. Then, slowly, as if surrendering to a force he could no longer fight, he sagged against her, his head bowed, and he rested his forehead against her shoulder. She held him, her own tears now falling freely, wetting the dark wool of his coat. She held the grieving boy who had lost his parents, the tormented man who had built a fortress around his heart. And she simply held him, as the winter sun streamed through the glass panes of the restored orangery. A silent witness to the turning of a long and painful tide. The air was filled with the scent of earth and jasmine, the scent of new life. In the heart of the desolate, frozen manor, in a room dedicated to a lost mother, a profound and seismic shift had just occurred. The ice had not just cracked, it had begun to melt. The aftermath of Beatrice's confession and Alistair's revelation was a profound, echoing silence that settled over the manor. It was not the oppressive, cold silence of before, but something different, a quiet space for healing, for breathing. Beatrice was gone. She had packed her things and departed within the hour, a spectral figure vanishing into the snow-swept landscape, leaving behind only the poisonous residue of her long-held secrets. Alistair retreated. He did not withdraw behind his old walls of ice, but into a place of deep, quiet introspection. He took his meals in his study, and Eleonora did not press him. She understood that the wounds he was now tending were a decade old and had been brutally torn open. They needed time and peace to begin to scar over. Eleonora devoted herself to Clara, who was recovering her strength with remarkable speed. The girl's laughter, at first a tentative, rusty sound, began to be heard more frequently in the halls of the East Wing. Eleonora read to her, played quiet games of cards with her, and, as her strength returned, took her for short, bundled-up walks in the less overgrown parts of the garden. They never spoke of what Clara had uttered in her delirium, nor of the terrible events that had been the genesis of her long illness. For now, it was enough that she was healing, that the shadows in her grey eyes were receding, replaced by a youthful light. Eleonora also continued her work in the orangery. It had become more than a project. It was a sacred space. The act of nurturing the plants, of bringing order and beauty to the long-neglected room, felt like an external manifestation of the healing she hoped was happening within the manor's master. One afternoon, as she was transplanting the jasmine into a larger pot, Alistair appeared in the doorway. He did not enter, but simply stood and watched her for a long time, his expression thoughtful. He looked rested, the deep lines of strain around his eyes having softened. The profound emptiness quietly and patiently tended the broken things in his home. "I only did what felt right," she said. "What was right," he corrected her gently, "is not always what is easy, or what is safe." He took a step into the room. "For 10 years I have lived by a set of rigid, self-imposed rules. I believed that safety lay in the absence of feeling. I built walls to keep out the chaos I saw destroy my family. I did not realize I had built a prison." He walked over to the bench, where she had held him as he'd broken down. He ran a hand over the smooth wood. "You did not try to tear down the walls, Eleonora. You simply planted a garden in their shadow. And you have shown me that life can grow anywhere if it is given a little light and a little care." His vulnerability was breathtaking. This was the man beneath the ice, the man his mother had written of in her journal, serious, quiet, but with a deep capacity for feeling that he had suppressed out of fear. "Your Grace, Alistair," she began, but she did not know what to say. "I have been a poor husband to you," he said, his voice low with regret. "I offered you a title and a cage. You have given me hope, a concept I had long since dismissed as a fool's luxury." He looked at her, and for the first time she saw a flicker of warmth in his pale eyes, a nascent heat that promised the return of a long-dormant sun. "I would like to begin again, if you would let me. Not as a duke and his contracted Duchess, but as a man and a woman, as Alistair and Eleonora." Her heart, which she had so carefully guarded, swelled with an emotion so powerful it almost stole her breath. It was not pity for his past, nor gratitude for his wealth. It was a deep, resonant feeling of connection to this broken, healing man. It was love, grown in the most unexpected and barren of soils. "I would like that very much," she whispered. The turning point was not a grand gesture, but a series of small, quiet moments. He began to join her and Clara for tea in the afternoons. He would sit, listening to their conversation, occasionally offering a dry, witty comment that would make Clara giggle. He started accompanying Eleonora on her stood in the doorway listening. "I have sent for a tuner from London," he said. "He will arrive next week. A house like this should have music in it." She smiled, her fingers stilling on the keys. "Thank you." He walked over to the instrument and stood beside her, his presence no longer oppressive but a comforting warmth. He looked down at her, his expression serious. "Eleonora," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "the contract I forced upon you. It was born of fear. I would not hold you to it. If you wish for your freedom, if you wish to leave this place and its ghosts behind, I will understand. I will see you are provided for. You have earned more than your freedom." She looked up at him, her heart aching at the thought. Leave. Leave this house she had begun to think of as home. Leave Clara? Leave him? The idea was inconceivable. "And if I do not wish to leave?" she asked, softly. A look of profound, vulnerable hope dawned on his face. "Then I would ask if you would consider being my wife, in truth, in all the ways that matter." He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently cupped her cheek. His touch was warm, tentative, electric. It was a question, a plea, a promise. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment as she savored the simple, profound intimacy of the gesture. "There is nothing I would like more," she said. He bent his head, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not one of fiery passion, but of deep, reverent tenderness. It was a kiss of gratitude, of homecoming. It was the sealing of a new contract, one written not on parchment, but on two hearts that had found each other in the dark. It was a promise of spring after a long, hard winter. The turning point had been reached, and the path ahead, though unknown, was finally, blessedly, illuminated by light. Spring came to Blackwood early that year, a soft, tentative greening of the world that felt like a direct reflection of the changes within the manor. The last of the snow melted away, revealing carpets of snowdrops and crocuses in the calm, the quiet confidence of a man who was no longer at war with his own past. He worked with his estate manager during the days, his mind engaged and purposeful, and spent his evenings with Eleonora and Clara. They would read, or talk, or sometimes just sit in companionable silence by the fire. The quiet, intimacy, a precious gift to them all. He and Eleonora were slowly, carefully, navigating the new geography of their relationship. They were husband and wife in truth now, sharing a suite of rooms. Alistair had quietly ordered his things moved to the East Wing, a symbolic gesture that spoke volumes. Their nights were filled with quiet conversation, with the simple, profound joy of sharing a bed, a touch, a whispered confidence in the dark. Their physical intimacy was a slow, tender exploration, a mirroring of the emotional intimacy they had fought so hard to build. For Eleonora, who had expected a life of cold solitude, it was a miracle. For Alistair, who had sworn off all deep feeling, it was a resurrection. He decided, as the season turned, that it was time to reintroduce Blackwood to the world. For a decade, the manor had been a place of rumor and speculation, its master a recluse. It was time to declare that the winter was over. "We will host a ball," he announced one evening, "a grand one, to celebrate the spring, to celebrate new beginnings." He looked at Eleonora, his eyes full of a deep, abiding love that still made her heart ache with its intensity. The preparations for the ball consumed the house for the next month. It was a joyful, chaotic endeavor. Eleonora, working with a flustered but delighted Mrs. Davies, oversaw every detail, from the menus to the flowers to the guest list. She discovered she had a natural talent for organization, a quiet authority that the staff, who now adored their new Duchess, responded to with loyalty and affection. Clara, her health fully restored, threw herself into the plans with girlish enthusiasm, her advice on floral arrangements and music proving invaluable. The night of the ball arrived, clear and starry. The manor, which had once been so dark and forbidding, was now a blaze of light, every window glowing with the warm, inviting light of 1,000 candles. Carriages crunched on the gravel drive, depositing guests who stared in astonishment at the transformation. The great hall, which had been so cold and cavernous, was now bright, confident, and radiant. Later in the evening, after the receiving line was finished, she took a moment to herself, slipping upstairs to catch her breath and fetch a new pair of gloves. As she made her way back down the grand staircase, she saw that the footman tasked with announcing the guests as they re-entered the ballroom had been replaced by a younger, less experienced man. He looked nervous, overwhelmed by the grandeur of the event. As she reached the bottom step, he saw her, and a look of panic crossed his face. He fumbled, unsure of the protocol. Should he announce the Duchess, who was already in attendance? He hesitated, his mouth opening and closing silently. A few guests nearby noticed his confusion, their conversations faltering as they turned to watch. A small, awkward silence began to spread. Eleonora felt a flush of embarrassment, not for herself, but for the flustered young servant. She gave him a small, reassuring smile, about to simply walk past him into the ballroom. But then, from across the room, Alistair's voice rang out, clear and strong, filled with a pride and love that cut through the murmur of the crowd and reached every corner of the vast room. "Announce my Duchess!" It was not a command born of arrogance, but a declaration, a statement of fact, of honor, of profound possession in the most beautiful sense of the word. My Duchess. The two words were laden with everything they had overcome. The cold contract, the years of grief, the walls of fear. They were a public acknowledgement of her place, not just as the mistress of his home, but as the absolute center of his world. The young footman's face cleared, his back straightening. He drew a deep breath, his voice booming with newfound confidence. "Her Grace, the Duchess of Blackwood!" A hush fell over the ballroom, followed by a wave of turning heads. Every eye was on her, but Eleonora saw only one person. Alistair was walking toward her, his gaze locked with hers, a slow, wonderful smile on his face. He reached her at the entrance to the ballroom, took her hand, and raised it to his lips. "My beautiful, brilliant Duchess," he murmured, his voice for her alone. "Forgive me for ever thinking I could live with infinitely more." She was his partner, his confidant, his salvation. She was his love, and he was hers. The dance was a celebration, a promise, and a beginning, all at once. Later that evening, when the ball was at its height, Alistair took her hand and led her away from the heat and noise of the ballroom. He guided her through a set of French doors onto a wide stone terrace overlooking the gardens. The night air was cool and sweet, fragrant with the scent of damp earth and the promise of blooming roses. The music from the ballroom was a muted, romantic murmur behind them. The gardens were bathed in moonlight. The familiar shapes of the paths and flower beds softened into a landscape of silver and shadow. From here, they could see the orangery, its glass panes reflecting the distant candlelight from the manor, making it look like a captured constellation. "It is a beautiful night," Eleonora said softly, leaning against the stone balustrade. "It is the most beautiful night of my life," Alistair replied, his voice a low, intimate rumble. He came to stand behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist as he drew her back against his chest. She leaned her head back against his shoulder, her contentment so complete it was a physical sensation, a warmth that spread through her entire being. They stood in silence for a long moment, simply watching the moonlight on the gardens, feeling the steady rhythm of each other's breathing. "Do you remember the terms of our arrangement, Eleonora?" he asked finally, his lips close to her ear. She smiled. "I believe there was mention of separate wings and a distinct lack of affection." "A fool's bargain," he murmured, his arms tightening around her. "The desperate act of a man who thought a heart was a liability. I look at you now, and I cannot imagine how I ever thought I could live in the same house as you and not love you. It seems like the most profound kind of madness." He turned her gently in his arms to face him. He took both of her hands in his gaze serious and searching in the moonlight. "The contract we signed is meaningless to me now," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It is a relic of a life I no longer lead, of a man I no longer am. You have shown me what it is to live again, to feel again. You have healed this house. You have found a home. I love you. I think I have loved you for a long time, even when you were a cold, impossible stranger. I think I saw the man you could be, and I loved him." A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. He reached up and brushed it away with his thumb, his touch infinitely tender. "Then let us make a new vow," he said, "not as a duke and a duchess bound by law, but as a husband and wife bound by love. I, Alistair Thorne, vow to spend the rest of my days honoring you, cherishing you, and loving you. I vow to fill your life with as much light as you have brought into mine." "And I, Eleonora Thorne," she replied, her voice gaining strength, "vow to stand by your side, to share your joys and your sorrows. I vow to love you, and to continue planting gardens in all the dark corners of our life, together." He smiled, a true, unguarded smile of such radiant happiness that it took her breath away. "Together." He lowered his head, and kissed her. A deep, searching kiss that was a culmination of their entire journey. It held the memory of sorrow and the promise of joy, the comfort of companionship, and the fire of a love hard-won and deeply treasured. It was a vow, a declaration, and a celebration all in one. When they finally broke apart, they remained on the terrace, holding each other, their foreheads pressed together. The music of the waltz drifted out from the ballroom, a soundtrack for their new beginning. They had faced the ghosts of the past and emerged into the light, their union no longer a cold contract, but a true and passionate partnership. The future of Blackwood Manor, and of its Duke and Duchess, was no longer a matter of duty or endurance. It was a future to be built, together, on the unshakable foundation of their love. 1 year later, the late spring sun streamed through the immaculate glass panes of the orangery, illuminating a scene of vibrant, joyful life. The room was a paradise of color and scent. The lemon and orange trees, once skeletal and dying, were now lush and green, dotted with fragrant white blossoms and the first blush of young fruit. The winter jasmine climbed its trellis in a riot of sweet-smelling flowers, and the beds were overflowing with orchids, ferns, and brilliant bluebells. In the center of the room, on a blanket spread on the warm stone floor, sat Eleonora, her back against a large terracotta pot. Her lap was occupied by her son, 6-month-old Arthur, a sturdy baby with his father's jet-black hair and, she suspected, his mother's determined spirit. He gurgled happily, his tiny fists batting at a sunbeam. Clara sat beside them, a sketchbook open on her knees. She had blossomed into a confident, healthy young woman. Her talent for drawing, discovered and encouraged by Eleonora, had become her passion. She was sketching the baby, her brow furrowed in concentration, a small, happy smile playing on her lips. The shadows that had haunted her for so long were gone, banished by love and sunlight. The door to the orangery opened, and Alistair walked in. He was dressed not in the formal attire of a duke, but in the practical clothes of a landowner, his boots smudged with dirt. He had been out with his estate manager all morning, and his face was flushed with sun and satisfaction. He stopped for a moment in the doorway, his gaze taking in the scene before him, his sister, his wife, his son, all together in this room that had once been a tomb and was now the beating heart of their home. A look of such profound love and contentment settled on his features that Eleonora's heart swelled to see it. He crossed the room and dropped a kiss on her hair, then knelt to gently tickle his son's stomach, eliciting a delighted squeal. "He has your eyes," Alistair said to Eleonora, his voice soft. "He has your serious frown when he is contemplating his rattle," she countered, her own eyes sparkling with laughter. Alistair smiled and settled onto the blanket beside her, draping an arm around her shoulders. She leaned into his familiar warmth, her head resting in the crook of his neck. They were a portrait of domestic bliss, a family forged not from convenience, but from compassion and courage. Blackwood Manor was alive again. The silence was gone, replaced by the sound of a baby's laughter, the rustle of Clara's sketchpad, the murmur of a husband and wife's loving conversation. The gardens outside were being restored to their former glory. The house was filled with light, and the people within it were filled with a deep and abiding peace. Alistair reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, velvet-wrapped object. "I have something for you," he said. He unwrapped it to reveal a beautiful silver locket. He opened it. On one side was a miniature portrait of him, his grey eyes warm and smiling. On the other side was a tiny, exquisitely painted picture of a single sprig of winter-blooming jasmine. "So you always remember," he whispered, "how you brought the spring back to my life." Tears of pure happiness filled her eyes as he fastened the chain around her neck. She looked from the locket to the beautiful, thriving room around them, to the healthy, happy sisterly lives of those we care about, walls built of grief, of fear, of past hurts. It is our first instinct, perhaps, to try and tear them down with force, to demand entry into the locked-off places of the heart. But the story of Eleonora and Alistair reminds us of a quieter, more profound truth. It teaches us that sometimes the most powerful act is not to attack the wall, but to simply begin planting a garden in its shadow. It is the small, patient acts of compassion, the gentle word, the quiet presence, the steady, unwavering belief in the possibility of growth that can truly bring about a spring after a long winter. Healing is not a grand, dramatic event, but a slow, tender unfurling, like a jasmine vine finding its way toward the sun. Eleonora did not demand that Alastair change. She simply created an environment where change became possible. She tended to the neglected parts of his world with such love and dedication that she reminded him how to feel again. She brought life back, not by force, but by quiet, persistent care. So, when you are faced with a fortress, in yourself or in another, remember the lesson of the orangery. Do not lay siege to the castle. Instead, find the forgotten key, let in the light, and start to cultivate something beautiful. For it is often in nurturing the broken things that we find not only their healing, but our own as well. Thank you for listening. If this story touched your heart, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who might need a reminder that even the longest winter eventually gives way to spring.